Hero Time, Chapter 41, Void. Jen had been to the Null Void a few times, though never for long periods of time. It was true that Kevin knew the place better and would be more logically sound of a choice for this mission, but Jen could see the fear in his eyes at the thought of setting foot in that place again, and Gwen needed to be here to open and close the portal, so the one who went in after Manny and Helen could get back, hopefully with the two teens. But Jen objected strenuously to the tether. I can't fight free in this. Hell, it might break when I transform. Gwen had insisted, though, but as Jen hung, caught by the tether, as Animo laughed in the distance at Manny and Helen, she couldn't just do nothing. Oh, fuck this. She pulled off her jetpack and uncoupled the tether. Sorry, Gwen. She debated for a moment before slipping the jetpack back on and spinning the dial on the Omnitrix. Zapping Animo held a certain amount of nostalgia for her. It was almost like she was 10 years old again, and for a moment she wished that she could still go Stinkfly and wrap him up in goo, just for old time's sake. But times had changed quite a bit, it seemed, as the blast from Brainstorm that should have knocked Animo out only disoriented the now overly buff scientist. Helen dropped from his grip and zipped to Manny, grabbing him and Jen and taking off at top speeds. Jen had missed the speed of a Kineceleran. She only got to enjoy it for a moment, though. Too soon, they were pulling up hard in a cave. They were greeted by a tall, thin, blue man and his son. The two of them ushered the teens inside and back behind a false wall. As Jen peeked out from behind the facade, she saw why as she watched Null Guardians take most of the crops from the alien who'd hidden them along with his son. She moved to help, but a metal hand around her arm stopped her. There's nothing you can do for him now. We need to get you to the wrench. Jen stared at Manny. One of his hands had been replaced with a simplistic metal claw. What happened? She asked it almost under her breath. Helen shook her head. Devoid is too strong. We need to get you to the wrench. He thinks you might be the key to stopping him. Jen shrugged. I can figure out how to beat Animo. I've done it before. Manny scoffed. Yeah, 'cause I believe that she can beat him. Jen glared at the Tetraman, her eyes unconsciously dropping to his missing limb. He didn't used to be invulnerable or quite that strong. He was actually pretty scrawny. He relied on the animals he mutated and controlled. Seems like he's still controlling animals, but I want to know what kind of steroids he's been on since last time I saw him. Take me to this wrench. He seems to be the guy in charge. Helen nodded and took them the rest of the way at full speed. When they arrived, Jen shivered slightly. The atmosphere here in the Null Void was breathable but unpredictable. This spot seemed to be trapped in a perpetual and unusually cold sandstorm. They were stopped before they could go farther by a boy Jen had only seen in a short video back when they had first met Helen and Manny. Your brother? Jen asked, smiling slightly. She remembered that Helen had implied that Pierce had been killed during their exploits dumping random aliens into the Null Void, but that had been back when they had believed their Null Void projector to be a disintegrator. Yeah, she smiled. Jen, this is Pierce. Pierce Wheels. Pierce, this is Jen Tennyson. Pierce looked over her, frowning. Is it? Or is it a shapeshifter showing you what you want to see? Pierce used his own jetpack to leap over them and land on the bridge that was the only way forward. No one sees the wrench without getting through me first. Jen nodded and removed her jetpack, Pierce following her lead. Not exactly a fair fight, since you're quite sharp and I'm just me. Pierce raised his arms, and one of the spines on his arm grew. He snapped it off when it reached about 3.5 feet, a short staff, but a workable weapon nonetheless. He smiled as he tossed it to her. Be my guest. Jen caught the makeshift staff and tested its weight, spinning it in her hand. Jen had been in her fair share of fights in her life, probably more than most people her age, if she thought about it. She tended to be able to spot the difference between ones she could win on her own and the ones she would likely need help with. She just didn't often ask for help with her fights, preferring to sort them out herself and push herself to be better. Pierce was a fighter, but not traditionally trained. He fought with guerrilla tactics, strike hard and get out fast. She could take him down easily, especially if she transformed, but that would get her nowhere. So she threw the fight, letting Pierce pin her to the bridge after a few minutes of fighting, as the staff he'd given her spun off into the void. There was a tense moment before Pierce smiled. "She's legit." He helped her to her feet. "One of Devoid's spies would have wiped the floor with me." Jen glanced over at Manny and Helen, and was unsurprised to see Manny lowering 2 of his guns. "Wouldn't have lasted long after, though." Pierce gave Jen a calculating look. "Still not sure she's gonna be much help against Devoid. But we'll let the wrench decide." Jen shook her head and followed Pierce. He was quiet until they reached the house-like construction built into the rocks. Pierce turned to her, looking completely serious. "Don't eat anything he offers you." Jen frowned. "Why?" "Trust me, just don't eat it." He motioned her into the house, and she took a deep breath before stepping inside. The interior of the hut was dark, dimly lit only by the fire burning in a fireplace that seemed to serve as a makeshift stove. A figure sat before it, stirring a pot of something over the coals. It smelled sort of familiar, actually, but Jen brushed the thought aside for the moment. She did notice Manny, Helen, Pierce and Pierce watching from a crack in the curtain. "So you're the wrench. My friends say you need my help." The figure stood and reached up to a shelf above the fireplace that was made of the same stone as the walls. He was tall and large, but Jen couldn't tell more about him, as he was covered head to toe in a cloak. He pulled down 2 bowls. A quick glance at the doorway caught the 3 teens there flinching. Jen frowned and cleared her throat. "Look, it took a lot to get here." "Oh, I know." Jen froze, going stock still as the man in front of her filled both bowls and set them down on the mantel. She knew that voice. But there was no way. He had sacrificed himself. He was gone. Wasn't he? "Why don't you tell me all about it over a bowl of my famous caterpillar casserole?" He turned, his hood falling. Jen stared. There before her stood Grandpa Max, a man she had thought gone forever. She took a slight step back. "He's gone. Who are you?" Her question was both accusatory and had her close to tears. The pain in his eyes was almost palpable. "I understand why you'd think that, but it's really me, Jen. I can prove it, too. When you were 11, you asked me to take you to Galvin Prime to have Azimuth take off the watch. I asked you why. You told me never to tell anyone what you said." His eyes flicked to the door, and the curtain closed quickly, completely. Jen could hear Helen ushering Manny and Pierce away. "You told me that you didn't want any of the other aliens in the watch to be taken away from you, like malware took feedback. You said it was safer for them if you took off the watch. You called me 3 times over the next 5 years to talk you out of putting it back on. I told you the same thing every time." "You said it was my choice, and always would be," Jen said, tears lacing her voice. They were both silent for a moment before Jen ran full pelt into her grandfather's arms. "I missed you so much." She muttered it into his chest as he held on. "I missed you too, kiddo." His explanation as to how he'd come to be living in the null void for the past few months, leading a resistance movement against Anima, was quick. Even he wasn't sure why he'd ended up here instead of being vaporized like the hybrid in the egg machine. Jen's story was a bit longer, though she gave him the simple Cliff Notes version, leaving out a lot of the things that didn't relate to the DNAliens and the hybrid. She also skipped over her time alone with Riney. That was a long story that she really didn't have time to get into. The fact that, according to the equipment Kevin had used to help Gwen scan the void for Helen, had showed the void itself was breaking down wasn't something she left out, though. Grandpa Max nodded, his face going grim. "Then it's happening faster than I anticipated." He stood and stepped over to the door, pulling the curtain open. "Pierce, gather your team. We have an assault to plan." Chapter 42. Assault. It only took a few minutes for all of them to be gathered in Max's makeshift house. There were maybe 10 of them, all of various species. Max turned an old cobbled-together hologram projector on and began explaining Animo's plan. Jen circled the hologram and picked up a small piece of corbamite Grandpa Max had been using as an example. Animo was wearing a piece of this. The pin on his cape had some on it. Pierce raised an eyebrow at her. Your point? I was wondering what kind of steroids he's been on, and I think I found my answer. Animo is nuts. But he's an inventive kind of nuts. And he understands how to change biology. If we can get that off of him, maybe he loses the invulnerability.
Smart theory, Pierce stated, but the problem remains, how do we get in? His fortress is surrounded at all times by the majority of the Null Guardians.
Jen shook her head, tossing the piece of corbamite between her hands. The crops the Null Guardians take from the fields, where do those go? Directly into the fortress itself, Helen said, smiling as she caught on to Jen's idea. Max smiled proudly. Pierce leaned over to him.
You're right. I do like her. A quick thinker. Not much good in a fight, though.
Max laughed.
Son, if she wanted to win your fight, you wouldn't have stood a chance.
Pierce bristled, literally.
You're saying she let me win?
Yes, I did. But don't feel too bad, I did learn from the best, Jen said, tossing the corbamite to her grandfather, who nodded proudly. Their gambit worked perfectly, at first. But when Animo arrived with a full flock of Null Guardians, things went south. It was Pierce who managed to get a lucky shot in to damage the brooch Animo was using to hold on his cloak. He roared in pain as some of the yellow drained from his eyes, and he seemed to deflate slightly. You insolent cur! You've damaged my transmitter! Jen was busy fighting 6 Null Guardians, but she overheard what Animo said, and her mind kicked into overdrive. The furnace, burning not 6 feet from her, wasn't just powering the dimensional boar. It was powering Animo, too. Thinking fast, she baseball slid under a guardian and took off at a run towards the boar and the furnace underneath. Max Tennyson was a reasonable man who had seen a lot in his long life, but seeing his granddaughter dive headfirst into a machine capable of melting alien ore into a power source nearly stopped his heart. Animo laughed long and loud. Even the great Jen Tennyson realized I can't be beaten. That was when the steam began to rise from the furnace. But as the Null Guardians backed the freedom fighters closer to it, Max noticed something odd. The steam wasn't scalding like it should have been. It was frigid. In moments, Animo was screaming as ice climbed his machine, and the boar sputtered to a halt. Animo himself was glowing yellow as the power from the corbamite drained from him until he looked very much like he had when he had been tossed in here originally. Max had no compunctions about decking him in the face, though, as more ice rose from the depths of the machine. Standing atop the new-formed glacier was a female necrophrygian, her gender only discernible from the pattern on her wings, wrapped around her like a cloak. Green lights flashed, and Jen grinned at him from atop her impromptu ice sculpture.
Nicely done, Jen.
She slid down the ice, and Pierce caught her at the bottom of it so she wouldn't trip on the edge of what had been the lip of the pit. Manny and Helen were securing Animo. Max shook his head at his granddaughter.
A little warning before you dive into a furnace next time. Wouldn't go amiss, though.
No time, Jen shrugged. I had to take out Animo quick. Max hugged her close, and she returned it wholeheartedly. It was then that the pink light appeared above them. Gwen had been trying to track her cousin all day, ever since the line had gone slack and they'd pulled it back in empty. It was exceedingly difficult to do between dimensions. She'd had to use something of Jen's to manage it. Ripping open another portal between dimensions was even more difficult. It was like trying to hold a hydraulic press off with her bare hands. Gwen, look who I found. The redhead nearly lost her grip on the portal when she caught sight of Grandpa Max.
Hey, Pumpkin.
You're alive! He smiled at her.
We Tennysons are hard to kill,
he said, grinning and ruffling Jen's hair. The brunette turned to him, understanding in her eyes. You're not coming back with me, are you? Grandpa Max shook his head.
I need to finish things here. Set the Null Guardians back to the task they're supposed to be doing.
Jen hugged him hard. The minute we're done with the Highbreed, I'm mounting a rescue mission. Max held her tight.
I'd expect nothing less from the excellent leader you're becoming. I love you, sweetie.
He turned to Gwen.
I'm so proud of both of you.
Gwen almost didn't manage to get Jen through her portal. Holding it open and pulling her through at the same time was next to impossible. Kevin stepped in, ducking under Gwen's arm and grabbing Jen under the elbows, bodily hauling her out of the null void. Jen grinned and hugged her cousin tight. After returning the embrace for a moment, Gwen smacked her cousin in the back of the head. What the hell were you thinking? Taking off the cable was so stupid. Jen ducked, laughing. So was dangling around like a cat toy. I got stuck. I told you I couldn't fight on a leash. Jen was all smiles as she dodged her cousin's rage. It seemed like a brighter smile than any Kevin had seen on her face since meeting her again.
You seem pretty chipper,
Kevin stated as the three of them packed away the equipment they'd used. After checking to see that the null void was stabilizing again, she nodded slightly. Grandpa Max is alive. I have every reason to be happy. We'll beat the Highbreed and get him and the plumber's kids out of there. There was such conviction in her voice that Kevin had to take a second look at her. She seemed different, more confident, as if having her grandfather affirm her place as leader, had her believing it at last. Gwen's smile was downright radiant as she grabbed Kevin's hands and linked arms with her cousin. First things first, we need to tell our parents he's okay. Jen nodded and they all set off for Kevin's car.